You believe you are respected because no one openly challenges you, interrupts your sentences, or dismisses your ideas in public conversations, and that absence of confrontation feels like validation. But silence is not proof of respect. It is often proof that no one considers you structurally threatening enough to warrant resistance, opposition, or deliberate engagement. Most people confuse politeness with status, assuming that calm tones, neutral expressions, and agreeable responses indicate a stable position within the hierarchy of a room. In reality, politeness frequently masks indifference, because true respect alters behavior under pressure, while politeness simply maintains surface-level social comfort. People can genuinely like you, enjoy your company, and appreciate your personality, while still disregarding your boundaries and quietly discounting your influence. You measure respect by emotional warmth and relational ease, but systems measure respect by visible stability, firmness, and the ability to maintain position under tension. Machiavelli observed that people respond less to moral virtue and more to perceived strength, because strength signals durability, while virtue alone signals vulnerability. This strength is not loud aggression or theatrical dominance, but structural firmness, the clear demonstration that your position will not collapse under minimal pressure. When your position shifts easily, when your tone softens quickly, when your boundaries blur without resistance, the system recalibrates around that instability. No one announces this recalibration. There is no public demotion, no formal decision, only subtle changes in how often you are consulted, challenged, or prioritized. You begin to notice conversations happening without you, decisions forming elsewhere, and subtle shifts in tone that suggest your presence is optional rather than structurally necessary. Nothing overt signals this shift. No one declares your decline, yet invitations decrease, interruptions increase, and your influence feels thinner than before. You interpret this as coincidence or changing circumstances, but structural systems rarely operate by accident. They respond consistently to visible behavioral signals. When you yield quickly in disagreement, soften boundaries under mild pressure, or prioritize harmony over clarity, you transmit data about your structural stability. Hierarchy does not require cruelty to function. It requires differentiation, visible markers that distinguish who holds position and who adapts to it. If you are consistently the one adjusting, accommodating, and absorbing tension, the system categorizes you accordingly, regardless of your intentions. Machiavelli argued that rulers must learn how not to be good when goodness threatens stability, because virtue without firmness invites structural erosion. This is not a call for manipulation or aggression, but an observation. Visible softness under pressure lowers perceived authority. Respect alters microbehaviors, pauses before interruption, careful phrasing, controlled disagreement, and these signals rarely appear without structural reason. If those signals are absent around you, if correction feels effortless and dismissal carries no hesitation, the hierarchy has already recalculated your level. Hierarchy is rarely announced. It emerges quietly from repeated interactions, small concessions, and visible patterns of who adjusts and who remains structurally unmoved. When you consistently de-escalate tension before others feel it, you absorb instability for the group, but you also reduce the perceived necessity of your authority. Authority is often confused with dominance, yet true authority is the visible capacity to withstand pressure without immediate adaptation or apology. If you apologize for clarity, soften your tone to avoid discomfort, or dilute your position to maintain acceptance, the system notes your flexibility. Flexibility is valuable in negotiation, but chronic flexibility without counterbalance signals that your boundaries are negotiable under minimal resistance. People do not consciously downgrade you. Instead, they recalibrate expectations, speaking more freely, interrupting more casually, and consulting you less strategically. What feels like comfort to you may feel like structural permission to others, permission to deprioritize your input when pressure rises. Machiavelli warned that being loved without the capacity to enforce limits produces fragile loyalty, easily displaced when circumstances shift. Respect stabilizes position because it creates hesitation before boundary violation, while mere affection evaporates the moment incentives change. If you feel secure only when others are comfortable, your position depends on emotional temperature rather than structural strength, and temperature fluctuates constantly. Respect is not affection, admiration, or friendliness. It is a structural response to perceived stability within a hierarchy defined by consequence, position, and visible resistance under pressure. Affection is emotional and fluctuates with mood, but respect is strategic and anchored in visible patterns of firmness that suggest reliability under tension and social pressure. Thomas Hobbes argued that social order arises not from mutual kindness, but from recognizable authority capable of enforcing consequence when cooperation begins to weaken. Without visible consequence, agreement becomes optional, compliance becomes negotiable, and negotiable authority gradually dissolves into background influence rather than decisive structural weight. Respect introduces hesitation before interruption, caution before dismissal, and calculation before open contradiction, because violating structure carries an anticipated cost. If others interrupt you casually, contradict you effortlessly, or overlook your input repeatedly, structural friction is absent and your perceived cost of disregard remains low. This absence rarely reflects cruelty. It reflects recalibration based on consistent signals of adaptability, compliance, and low resistance to incremental boundary testing. Machiavelli observed that rulers must actively manage perception because perception determines response more reliably than internal virtue, intention, or moral sincerity. If you intend firmness but display accommodation, the structure responds to what is visible and consistent, not to what is privately felt or internally justified. People rarely test what appears immovable and clearly bounded. Instead, they test what seems flexible, adjustable, and emotionally invested in preserving comfort over structural clarity. When you repeatedly adjust your tone to reduce discomfort, others begin to associate stability with your flexibility rather than with any fixed or enforceable structural boundary. Hierarchy naturally stabilizes around the individual who appears least reactive under pressure, because visible composure signals durability within systems structured by consequence and power. If your responses fluctuate whenever tension rises, the structure interprets volatility instead of strength and gradually lowers your perceived authority within the relational hierarchy. Machiavelli insisted that leaders must appear consistent even when internally conflicted, because visible inconsistency erodes confidence in structural reliability and weakens authority across unstable systems. Perceived reliability reduces the likelihood of open challenge, while visible uncertainty invites testing, hesitation, and gradual expansion of previously respected interpersonal boundaries. Respect grows where visible limits remain intact across situations, rather than dissolving whenever relational harmony feels threatened or socially inconvenient under mounting interpersonal pressure. If maintaining harmony requires repeated compromise of clarity, harmony becomes structurally superior to your position within the hierarchy, gradually redefining where you actually stand. When comfort consistently outranks clarity in your decisions, your authority becomes conditional upon collective mood rather than anchored in principled structural stability. People instinctively gravitate toward individuals whose boundaries appear predictable under stress, because predictability reduces systemic uncertainty during moments of social tension. If your boundaries fluctuate according to emotional climate, your position becomes negotiable precisely when structural firmness is required most urgently. Hobbes argued that visible enforcement of order prevents regression into chaos, because predictable consequence anchors behavioral expectations within any functioning social hierarchy. In interpersonal systems, enforcement rarely means punishment. It means consistent boundary maintenance despite discomfort, tension, or the temporary risk of relational instability. When others observe that your limits remain intact across contexts, they adjust interaction patterns proactively, reducing attempts at boundary expansion before overt conflict emerges. Respect therefore functions as a preventive force, discouraging violation through anticipated resistance rather than relying on reactive confrontation after structural damage occurs. If anticipated resistance is absent, violation becomes experimentation, and repeated experimentation gradually normalizes into routine behavior within the relational hierarchy. Normalization of minor violations quietly redefines hierarchy without explicit declaration or dramatic confrontation, because repeated tolerance reshapes perceived authority at a structural level. You may not consciously detect this shift at first, because structural change often precedes emotional awareness and rational interpretation by a significant margin. By the time discomfort becomes explicit, your perceived position may already have recalibrated downward within the broader architecture of social perception. Reclaiming respect requires altering visible behavioral signals, not merely refining internal intention, because systems respond to consistent patterns rather than private moral narratives. Until those signals shift consistently under pressure, hierarchy remains structurally stable, even if your internal self-concept evolves toward greater clarity. You do not consciously choose a lower position. You adapt incrementally, adjusting tone, posture, and intensity in response to subtle environmental pressure. Carl Jung described the persona as a social mask developed for survival, shaped by what the environment rewards and what it quietly discourages. Over time, this persona can become confused with identity, making adaptive shrinking feel like authenticity rather than strategic compromise. When you repeatedly soften your presence to maintain acceptance, your nervous system begins to equate reduction with safety. Safety becomes the primary metric of interaction, gradually replacing position, influence, and structural standing as central organizing principles. You begin anticipating discomfort before it arises, preemptively adjusting yourself to prevent friction that may never have materialized. This anticipatory shrinking feels responsible and mature, yet structurally it signals that pressure need not increase for you to adapt. People unconsciously map hierarchy through microsignals: eye contact duration, interruption tolerance, speaking pace, and physical positioning within shared space. If your microsignals communicate withdrawal, hesitation, or premature concession, others recalibrate around that information without deliberate malice. Hierarchy rarely requires explicit confrontation. It consolidates through repetition of small signals that accumulate into a stable structural narrative. Each time you yield before pressure intensifies, You reinforce a behavioral pattern in which adaptation precedes resistance and concession replaces structural testing. Over months and years, this pattern becomes internalized, making self-reduction feel automatic rather than chosen. Jung warned that over-identification with the persona fragments the self, because the mask gradually replaces the underlying structure of authentic agency. When agency fragments, clarity weakens, and weakened clarity reduces your ability to maintain visible boundaries under social tension. You begin editing yourself in real time, filtering opinions, softening disagreement, and compressing intensity to avoid perceived relational risk. What once required external pressure now requires only anticipation, because your internal monitoring system activates before others intervene. In this state, hierarchy no longer needs to assert dominance explicitly. Your nervous system has already optimized for de-escalation. The cost of confrontation feels exaggerated, while the cost of shrinking feels minimized and justified as prudence or maturity. Gradually, you mistake reduced visibility for humility, unaware that humility without structural firmness often reads as dispensability. And once dispensability enters the structural narrative, reclaiming influence requires far more than simply intending to stand taller. Reclaiming influence begins not with a single dramatic act, but with consistent recalibration of small behavioral signals that others unconsciously use to measure your structural position. You must first notice the automatic reflex to soften, apologize, or retreat before tension even fully materializes, because that reflex is the actual mechanism producing your decline. Jung suggested that confronting the shadow, the disowned parts of the self, restores wholeness by integrating traits the persona was trained to suppress for acceptance. Part of that shadow, for many people, is simply the capacity to disappoint others without collapsing internally or abandoning a clearly defined position. If disappointing others feels catastrophic, your nervous system has learned to treat relational friction as existential danger rather than ordinary social feedback. Reclaiming position requires tolerating brief discomfort without immediately resolving it through concession, because premature resolution is precisely what taught the hierarchy your limits. This does not require aggression, volume, or dominance display. It requires stillness, the visible refusal to resolve tension through self-erasure. Stillness under pressure communicates more structural information than words ever could, because behavior under tension is what systems actually measure and remember. Each time you tolerate discomfort without collapsing into accommodation, you slightly rewrite the pattern that previously defined your place in the hierarchy. This rewriting is slow, often invisible at first, but it forms the structural foundation required before any external repositioning becomes possible. Machiavelli's central insight was never about cruelty. It was about recognizing that perception governs behavior more reliably than private virtue or good intention ever could. A leader who is loved but never feared risks losing authority the moment personal loyalty conflicts with someone else's competing self-interest. Fear, in this context, does not mean terror or abuse. It means the presence of consequence that makes betrayal costly rather than convenient. Without any consequence attached to disregard, loyalty becomes conditional, evaporating precisely when circumstances shift or better opportunities quietly present themselves. This is why relationships built purely on affection often collapse under pressure, while those anchored in mutual respect tend to endure. Respect requires that others believe disregarding you carries a real cost, not necessarily severe, but consistent enough to shape their calculations. Machiavelli's deeper argument was that stability protects more people than idealism alone, because unstable systems eventually harm everyone within them equally. Applied personally, this means your boundaries exist not to punish others, but to preserve the structural integrity that protects everyone involved. When you remove consequence entirely from your interactions, you inadvertently invite instability, because nothing signals where the structure will not bend. Perception, then, is not deception. It is the visible evidence others use to determine how much your position can withstand. Consider two colleagues with identical skill, where one enforces clear limits while the other accommodates every request. Observers instinctively assign more authority to the former. This is not because competence differs, but because visible firmness signals structural weight that mere willingness to help can never fully replace. Systems constantly run informal calculations about who can be pressured without cost and who cannot, updating these estimates with every single interaction. Every time you absorb pressure silently, the calculation shifts slightly in favor of further pressure, because absorption without cost invites repetition. Reversing this calculation does not require confrontation on every occasion, but it does require occasional visible resistance that recalibrates the entire pattern. A single instance of firm refusal often carries more structural weight than months of quiet accommodation, because rarity increases perceived significance. This explains why people who rarely say no are often taken more seriously the one time they finally do, structurally speaking. The scarcity of resistance amplifies its structural signal, while constant resistance risks being dismissed as mere personality rather than genuine boundary. This is why structural awareness matters more than constant assertiveness, because timing and consistency outperform volume in shaping long-term perception. Understanding when to hold firm and when to yield voluntarily becomes the actual skill, far more valuable than universal rigidity or universal compliance. Voluntary yielding differs fundamentally from forced yielding, because the former preserves authority while the latter quietly erodes it with each occurrence. When you choose to give ground deliberately, from a position of stability, the structure reads generosity rather than weakness in that decision. But when ground is taken from you through pressure or discomfort, the structure reads vulnerability, regardless of how the concession is framed afterward. This distinction explains why identical outcomes can produce opposite structural effects, depending entirely on who appeared to initiate the decision. Reclaiming initiative, even symbolically, restores a measure of authority that pure reaction to external pressure can never fully recover. This is not about manipulation or theatrical display, but about ensuring your actions genuinely originate from clarity rather than fear. Fear-based accommodation and clarity-based accommodation can look identical from outside, yet they produce entirely different structural consequences over time. The difference lies internally, in whether the decision was extracted through discomfort or offered freely from a stable internal position. Over time, others sense this difference intuitively, even without being able to articulate exactly what shifted in the dynamic between you. This is the structural foundation Machiavelli pointed toward, not domination, but the disciplined alignment of perception, timing, and genuine internal stability. Rebuilding structural position does not begin with grand gestures. It begins with noticing the exact moment your body prepares to concede before thought even occurs. That preparatory moment, often felt as tightness or urgency, is where change becomes possible, because everything after it is simply automatic execution. Interrupting that automatic sequence requires a brief pause, not silence forever, just enough space to choose response instead of reflex. In that pause, you are not deciding whether to be kind or cruel. You are deciding whether to act from clarity or urgency. Structural rebuilding also requires reducing unnecessary explanation, because over-justifying a boundary often signals that the boundary itself feels unstable to you. A boundary stated plainly, without elaborate justification, communicates more confidence than the same boundary wrapped in apology and lengthy reasoning. This does not mean withholding context entirely, but recognizing that excessive explanation often functions as a disguised request for permission. Another structural shift involves tolerating the discomfort of silence after stating a position, rather than immediately filling it with reassurance. Silence after a boundary often feels unbearable at first, yet it is precisely this discomfort that trains others to accept the new structure. If you rush to soften every boundary immediately afterward, you effectively cancel the structural signal you just worked to establish. Consistency across different contexts matters more than intensity in any single moment, because systems trust patterns far more than isolated displays of strength. If you hold a boundary firmly at work but abandon it completely at home, the underlying pattern remains structurally weak and easily exploited. Rebuilding, therefore, requires auditing every domain of your life honestly, identifying where accommodation has quietly become the default operating mode. This audit is uncomfortable because it reveals how widespread the pattern actually is, extending far beyond the single relationship you initially noticed. Start with the domain carrying the lowest emotional risk, because early success there builds the internal evidence needed for harder domains later. Internal evidence matters because self-perception rarely changes through insight alone. It changes through accumulated proof gathered from direct experience. Each small successful boundary becomes data your nervous system uses to recalibrate its baseline assumption about what happens when you hold firm. Over repeated instances, holding a boundary stops feeling dangerous and starts feeling neutral, which is the actual marker of structural change. Neutrality, not confidence or triumph, is the real destination, because confidence still carries emotional charge that neutrality has already resolved. When boundaries feel neutral rather than confrontational, you have completed the structural shift from reactive accommodation to deliberate, stable positioning. Once neutrality becomes the baseline, warmth can return without risk, because kindness offered from stability no longer functions as an invitation to exploit. This is the paradox rarely discussed. Structural firmness does not eliminate kindness. It simply removes the desperation that once made kindness exploitable. People with genuine structural stability often appear warmer, not colder, because their kindness carries no underlying fear of abandonment or rejection. Fear-driven kindness is anxious and reactive, constantly monitoring for approval, while stability-driven kindness is calm and requires no external confirmation. This calmness is precisely what systems and relationships eventually recognize as trustworthy, because it does not fluctuate under pressure or uncertainty. Trust, structurally speaking, is not built through constant availability, but through predictable behavior that remains consistent regardless of external demand. Predictability of principle, not predictability of compliance, is what ultimately earns durable respect within any long-term relationship or hierarchy. This entire rebuilding process is slow by design, because structures that form quickly under pressure tend to collapse just as quickly under it. Patience with this process is itself a structural signal, demonstrating that your sense of worth no longer depends on immediate external validation. By the end of this rebuilding, you are no longer performing goodness for acceptance. You are practicing clarity as a stable way of being. Everything explored so far converges on a single realization. Goodness and structure were never actually opposites, only mismatched when practiced without awareness of each other. The good person who loses is not someone whose values are wrong, but someone whose values were never given a stable structure to stand on. Structure without goodness becomes cold manipulation, while goodness without structure becomes a resource that eventually gets depleted by those around it. Neither extreme survives contact with reality for long, because both fail to account for how systems actually process behavior over time. The synthesis is neither compromise nor balance in the diluted sense, but the recognition that clarity is what allows goodness to remain intact. Clarity protects kindness the way a container protects water, giving it shape and preventing it from dissolving into whatever surrounds it. Without that container, kindness spreads thin, absorbed by every demand until nothing distinct remains of the person offering it. This is why the most respected people are rarely the most agreeable ones, but rather those whose agreement actually means something specific. Their yes carries weight because their no exists and has been demonstrated, giving every subsequent agreement genuine structural value. None of this requires becoming someone harder or colder than you actually are, because structural clarity is not a personality transplant, but a skill layered on top. You remain fundamentally who you were, except now your kindness is protected by boundaries that prevent it from being mistaken for unlimited availability. The transformation is less about becoming a different person and more about removing the friction between your intention and your visible behavior. Most people are not misunderstood because their character is unclear, but because their behavior has not yet caught up with their actual values. Closing that gap between value and behavior is the real work, far more demanding than simply deciding to think differently about yourself. It requires repeated practice in small, low-stakes situations before it becomes reliable in the moments that actually determine your position. Every rebuilt boundary, every tolerated silence, every voluntary act of firmness becomes part of a new baseline that others eventually adjust to. This adjustment is rarely announced or discussed directly. It simply appears as a shift in how people speak to you, defer to you, or challenge you. The good person who once lost quietly begins winning just as quietly, not through domination, but through the simple fact of being harder to dismiss. Nothing about their values changed. Only the structure surrounding those values became solid enough to survive contact with a world that tests everything. This is not a story about becoming ruthless, and it was never meant to be, because ruthlessness collapses under the same pressure that reveals every other unstable structure. It is a story about noticing that kindness needs a foundation, the same way a house needs one, regardless of how beautiful its design might be. Without that foundation, even the most sincere intentions eventually settle, crack, and quietly collapse under the accumulated weight of daily interaction. The good person does not need to disappear or transform into someone unrecognizable. They simply need to stop mistaking softness for the entire structure. Softness is one room within a larger house, valuable and necessary, but never designed to bear the full weight of the roof alone. Boundaries, clarity, and consistency are the walls and beams that allow softness to remain exactly where it belongs, protected rather than exposed. Once that architecture exists, kindness stops being a liability and becomes instead the most stable, most trusted feature of the entire structure. This is the quiet reversal at the center of everything explored here. Structure does not replace goodness. It is what finally lets goodness last. The world will still reward calculation over pure intention in many rooms you enter, but calculation without integrity eventually collapses on its own. What remains, in the end, is not the ruthless or the naive, but the person who learned to be good on a foundation strong enough to hold.